Hello there, my fellow Romans. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel if you're new. Welcome back if you aren't. I'm EDJ, and we are continuing with Julius Caesar by Historia Civilis. We're now covering the Battle of Sabis. This will be another quick, short video. I don't really have much else to add. We've kind of covered this already through kings and generals, but let's see what new things I can gauge from Historia Civilis. So let's just get right into it. Let's do this.
In the year 57 BCE, Julius Caesar was in the first phase of his 9-year campaign against the Gallic peoples. He had had some early success against some of the initial resistance, and managed to march his army far enough north to finally come into contact with the Belgae, whom he called the bravest of all the Gauls. His first encounter with these people happened when he and his army were encamped on a large hilltop. After hearing about Caesar's victories to the south, an agreement had been reached among the Belgae tribes to put aside their differences and meet this new threat as one. Unannounced, a huge Belgae army descended on his position. The two sides sent their cavalry forward for some light skirmishes, but the main forces kept their distance. Caesar, not wanting to abandon his strong position, deployed for battle way up on the hillside. The Belgae deployed at the bottom, just on the other side of a small swamp. These were good defensive positions, and both sides knew it. The two armies would start to get into a pattern, where they would both deploy and just stare at each other all day. This went on for a while. The Belgae came with enough food to last for a handful of days, but this was quickly turning into a siege. The tribes held a late-night meeting and put the matter to a vote. In the end, they decided to go home and resupply, but vowed to return if Caesar took any aggressive action. This is much easier said than done. But what an incredible turn of luck for Caesar. The next day, the Belgae army just melted away in front of him. After a couple of days...
Yeah, I was wilding when he was actually when Kings and Generals kind of was covering the... Yeah, sorry, I was just seeing where I am. Okay. So yeah, I was wilding when Kings and Generals covered this because it's like they just left. And yeah, they were kind of at a stalemate there. It's like, no side would just wants to throw away a defensive position, right? That'd be like basically handing the enemy the win. But they just left and like, Julius Caesar kept going, so I don't know, it's just overall wild.
Caesar set off after the largest and most formidable tribe, the Nervii. The Nervii had been the chief opponents of breaking up the Belgae coalition. After some negotiations, they convinced many like-minded tribes to stick together and form a new, smaller army, totaling around 75,000 men. They knew that Caesar would be coming after them, so they took their time choosing a good battlefield. They settled on an area intersected by a river called the Sabis, which was only about 3 feet deep and was nestled between two small hills. One hill opened up onto a wide open plain, and the other turned into a dense forest. The Belgae army crossed the river, slipped into the forest, concealed themselves, and waited. Caesar had with him somewhere between 30 and 40,000 men, split into 8 legions. He suspected that the crossing of the river Sabis may be contested, so he made his approach with caution. He set up a screen of cavalry and skirmishers to both scout ahead and act as a shield for the main force. He then had his most experienced legions drop their extra baggage and move up to the front, while his 2 rookie legions picked up the extra weight and stayed back, advancing with the baggage train. When the Romans arrived at the river, they didn't see any Belgae. Caesar decided that this hill protected by a river on one side was a good enough defensive position, so he had his men start to encamp for the night. The cavalry and skirmishers crossed to the other side of the river to scout ahead, as the infantry started fortifying the hill. Remember, the Belgae were already out there, silently watching from the tree line. When the Roman scouts got close, a signal was given and the Belgae attacked all at once, catching the Romans completely unaware. The cavalry and skirmishers immediately retreated across the river, desperately signaling to the main Roman army that they were under attack. The Roman infantry were all split up and busy setting up the camp for the night. Some were digging trenches, some were setting up tents, some were gathering firewood. Before Caesar even had time to sound his trumpets, his legion commanders were running around grabbing soldiers from random units and throwing them into ad hoc lines of battle. In no time at all, the Romans went from total disarray to having a disorganized but workable defensive line. By the time everybody was in position, the battle had already begun on the Roman right flank. The Belgae were immediately in danger of enveloping the line, and the Romans were giving ground. Some of the men dropped their weapons and began to flee. Caesar arrived on the scene, jumped off his horse, picked up a shield, and ran into his infantry, shouting encouragement and getting his men to physically push back against the Belgae with their shields. He was successful. The Belgae advance was stopped, and both sides paused for a moment to catch their breath. Caesar took this opportunity to quickly redeploy his men into a defensive square formation in order to avoid being enveloped on the right for a second time. Meanwhile, on the Roman left, 2 legions had charged downhill into enemy lines, and they were doing quite well. The Belgae forces on this side seemed a little thin, and the Romans were able to keep pushing all the way across the river. Once across the river, the Belgae collapsed into a full-on rout and fled into the woods. The ease of this victory must have made one of the legion commanders a little suspicious, because instead of joining in on the slaughter, he had his men turn and double time along the bank of the river back towards the Roman right flank. And on the right flank, the Romans were still in a fight for their lives. At some point in the fighting, a large number of Belgae had been able to force their way around the Romans on the right, and had started to make their way up the hill towards the Roman baggage train. Imagine the surprise of these 2 rookie legions when this huge Belgae raiding party crested the hill and charged. Meanwhile, that legion from the Roman left finally made it all the way to the Roman right, and discovered that the right was in danger of being totally overwhelmed. Despite being completely exhausted, this legion entered the battle for a second time, and charged the Belgae rear. The Belgae made a heroic last stand, but the writing was on the wall. Eventually, they were all killed.
Yeah, that one was a close one. Like, Julius Caesar was there on the right, you know, keeping the men, the morale high, but that was a real close one there for Caesar overall, you know.
And speaking of heroism, the 2 rookie legions had now officially entered the battle. After the Belgae charged, the fighting got absolutely ferocious. The Roman defensive lines broke down pretty quickly, and the whole thing turned into a giant free-for-all. It got so bad that slaves and civilians from the baggage train grabbed weapons and joined the fight. The Roman skirmishers and cavalry, who had barely escaped with their lives at the beginning of the battle, noticed what was happening and ran back to help. It was a long, bloody fight, but the rookies held their own, and eventually these last remaining Belgae surrendered to them. We don't know how many Romans were killed, but it was probably a lot. 4 of Caesar's 8 legions had been overrun at some point in the battle. In one anecdote, we're told that the 2 legions on the Roman right lost almost every one of their centurions. This explains why some of the men broke and ran. With this resounding victory over the Belgae, the first phase of Caesar's conquest of Gaul came to a close. Years of bloody campaigning remained, but this was the most extreme the fighting got until the Battle of Alesia, many years later, when the Gauls would make a valiant last stand against their new occupiers.
Dang. I did not know that was, like, I guess the second bloodiest, but yeah, man. It goes to show just, like, the resistance. And that was a real close one, like I said earlier, but overall, just, like, I also was shocked to learn that, yeah, this entire war was, like, what, 9 years or more? Like, I almost lost track of the time watching these things, but yeah, Caesar was in Gaul for a while before immediately kicking off the Civil War, so dang, yeah, man. But that's insane. But overall, I want to apologize for being a little quiet. Just kind of basically knew what was up. And yeah, overall, that was... What's next? Wait. Okay, more of the Gallic Wars. Alright. So I'll be jumping forward to that because I'm kind of just going through these. So I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, everyone.